The clock on the wall of courtroom number 3 seemed to move slower as the afternoon wore on. Each tick of its second hand, a dull, heavy sound in the thick, humid air. It was a room built for seriousness, with dark, polished wood panels that seemed to absorb the light and the hope from anyone who entered. At the front of this room, high above everyone else, sat Judge Alistair Finch. He was a man who looked like he had been carved from the same wood as his bench. His face lined with the deep creases of a lifetime spent listening to people argue. He was not a cruel man, not in his own mind, but he was a man who had very little time for what he considered nonsense. Efficiency was his god, and logic was his scripture. He had seen every trick, every lie, and every half-baked idea that people could bring before him, and he had grown tired of all of it. Today was no different. The day had been a parade of tedious disputes and pointless bickering, and Judge Finch could feel the familiar knot of impatience tightening in his stomach. He wanted the day to be over. He wanted to go home. He shuffled the papers in front of him, the crisp edges making a sharp, annoyed sound that cut through the quiet hum of the room's ancient air conditioner. His clerk, a thin woman who had worked with him for a decade and knew his moods better than anyone, kept her eyes fixed on her own desk, not daring to make a sound. Even the sharp-suited lawyers, who were usually so confident, seemed to be moving a little slower, their voices a little quieter, as if they were afraid to be the last case keeping the judge from his evening. The final matter on the docket for today. Your Honor, the clerk announced, her voice deliberately flat and devoid of any emotion. Civil case number 4, B991, Mrs. Agnes Blackwood. Petitioner versus Cresswell Culinary Corporation. Defendant. A quiet rustle of papers went through the few people still sitting in the public gallery. A young lawyer for the Cresswell Corporation, a man whose suit probably costs more than most people's cars, let out a tiny, almost silent sigh of relief. This was it. The last one. He glanced at his notes, a quick, dismissive flick of the eyes. This was the case his firm had told him would be a cakewalk. An old woman claiming a billionaire had stolen a recipe from her grandmother. It was the kind of story you tell to make people laugh, not the kind you bring into a court of law. Judge Finch looked down at the case file, a thin, almost pathetic-looking folder. He read the one-line summary on the cover and felt a familiar twitch of irritation start in his jaw. A recipe. He was being asked to preside over a dispute about a recipe. He could already feel the headache beginning to form behind his eyes. He leaned back in his large leather chair, the leather groaning under his weight, and steepled his fingers. He was ready for this to be over in 5 minutes. He would listen to the old woman's sentimental story. The defense lawyer would tear it apart with simple logic. And he would dismiss it. Simple, clean, efficient. Mrs. Agnes Blackwood, the clerk called out. The sound of the name hung in the air for a moment, and then a slow, shuffling sound came from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned. An old woman was making her way from the double doors, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of someone for whom every step was a challenge. She was small and hunched, her shoulders rounded forward as if she were carrying a great weight. She wore a simple, old-fashioned coat, even though it was warm outside. And on her head was a small, slightly crooked hat with a faded flower on it. She held on to a worn, leather-bound folder as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Her knuckles white with the effort of her grip. Each step she took seemed to take an age. The tap of her worn-out shoes on the polished floor was the only sound in the room. No one coughed. No one shuffled in their seat. They all just watched her. Some watched with a flicker of pity in their eyes, others with a cold, professional curiosity. Judge Finch watched her with a growing sense of impatience. This slow, fragile figure seemed to be the physical embodiment of the case itself, something from a bygone era, something that didn't belong in the fast, sharp world of his courtroom. She finally reached the front, and the bailiff helped her up the 2 steps into the witness stand. She sat down, arranging herself carefully, and placed her folder on the ledge in front of her. She looked up at the judge, her eyes a pale, watery blue, and for a moment, she seemed to be searching for some kindness in his face. She did not find it. Mrs. Blackwood, the judge began, his voice crisp and devoid of warmth, you are the petitioner in this case. Please state the nature of your claim against the Cresswell Culinary Corporation in your own words. And please, be brief." He added the last part with a heavy emphasis, a clear warning that he was not interested in a long, rambling story. The old woman swallowed hard, her throat working visibly. She opened her mouth, but at first only a small, croaking sound came out. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Your Honor," she began, her voice thin and reedy, like the sound of wind whistling through a crack, "my claim is not just about a recipe. It is about a promise. A promise made to my grandmother Elspeth." Judge Finch's expression didn't change. He simply raised a single eyebrow, a gesture that in his courtroom was more powerful than a shout. She took a shaky breath and continued. "You see, Arthur Cresswell, the father of the man who owns the company now. He was my grandmother's best friend. This was long ago, during the war. They were poor, but they had dreams. They had this blend of spices, something special. My grandmother's family had used it for generations. They decided to try and sell it. Mr. Cresswell, he was the one with the big ideas. He promised her on his word of honor, that if it ever made them rich, he would share it all with her. It was their secret, their legacy." She spoke with a simple, heartfelt earnestness that was completely out of place in the room. The judge could see the young lawyer for Cresswell Corporation smirking to himself. He had heard all of this before, of course, in his preparation for the case. A sob story, full of emotion and short on facts. He was ready to object on the grounds of relevance, but he waited for the judge to do it for him. He didn't have to wait long. Judge Finch let out a long, slow breath, a sound of pure exasperation. He was already preparing his dismissal in his head. There was no contract. There were no documents. Just the word of an old woman about a promise made 70 years ago. It was ridiculous. Mrs. Blackwood, however, seemed to take his silence as encouragement. "The secret wasn't just the spices," she said, her voice gaining a little strength, a little passion. "It was the trust. It was the bond of friendship. That was the real secret ingredient. That was the moment it happened." It started as a low chuckle, deep in the judge's chest. It was a sound of disbelief, of pure, unadulterated amusement at the sheer, breathtaking naivete of what he had just heard. "A bond of friendship?" he repeated, his voice laced with scorn. The chuckle grew. It bubbled up out of him, becoming a full, booming laugh that echoed off the wood paneling and filled every corner of the courtroom. It wasn't a small, private laugh. It was a loud, public, and utterly humiliating display of contempt. He laughed so hard that his shoulders shook. He took off his glasses and wiped a tear from the corner of his eye, shaking his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Madam," he managed to say, his voice still trembling with laughter, "a bond of friendship. This is a court of law, not a sentimental drama. We deal in facts, in contracts, in evidence, not in secret ingredients of friendship." He laughed again, and this time, the young lawyer from Cresswell Corporation joined in, a quiet, sycophantic chuckle that was just as cruel. The sound of their laughter was like a physical blow to Mrs. Blackwood. She sat frozen in the witness stand, her face a mask of disbelief. Her pale eyes, which had been looking at the judge with a fragile hope, now widened with shock and a deep-cutting shame. The hum of the air conditioner, the tick of the clock, the rustle of a lawyer's paper-right all faded away, replaced by the horrible, roaring sound of the judge's laughter. It was the sound of her story being ridiculed, her grandmother's memory being mocked, her entire life being dismissed as a joke. Her shoulders, which had been held so stiffly with resolve, suddenly slumped. Her head bowed forward, and the brim of her old hat hid her face from the room. But the judge was still laughing, and the sound was everywhere, bouncing off the walls, filling her ears and breaking what was left of her spirit. In the high court of law, on a hot and tired afternoon, the truth had just been told. It was a funny little story, and the whole world had laughed along. The last echo of the judge's laughter seemed to hang in the air, a ugly, ghostly sound that refused to fade away. For a long moment, no one in the courtroom moved or even seemed to breathe. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than the quiet that had come before it. It was a silence filled with a shared collective embarrassment. In the public gallery, a few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to look at the small, hunched figure in the witness stand. The young lawyer for the Cresswell Corporation allowed a final smug smile to play on his lips before smoothing his features into a mask of professional indifference. He had one. He knew it. The judge had already ridiculed the old woman's entire case. All that was left was the formal, rubber-stamped dismissal in the witness stand. Mrs. Agnes Blackwood felt as if a cold, hard stone had settled in her chest. The laughter had stripped her bare, leaving her feeling foolish and small. Her pride, which she had clung to for so many years, had been shattered into a million pieces. She could feel the hot prickle of tears behind her eyes, but she fought them back. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She kept her head bowed, the brim of her old hat hiding her face, her fingers still gripping the worn leather folder as if it were a life raft in a stormy sea. The world had shrunk to the small space of her own shame. Judge Finch leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk still on his face. He had restored order to his courtroom. He had put a stop to this nonsense. He picked up his pen, ready to scrawl a few dismissive notes that would seal the woman's fate and finally allow him to go home. "Well, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice dripping with condescending patience, as if speaking to a confused child. "This has been illuminating. But unless you have something more substantial than sentimental tales of friendship and secret ingredients, I think we are done here. So, I will ask one last time. Do you have any actual proof? Any document, any contract, anything at all, that this court can recognize as evidence?" He expected her to shake her head, to mumble a quiet no. Expected her to slink away in defeat. Instead, something stirred inside her. It was a tiny spark, deep in the pit of her stomach, fueled by years of being overlooked and a lifetime of knowing the truth. It was the spirit of her grandmother, a woman who had never backed down from a fight, not even when she had nothing left. Mrs. Blackwood slowly lifted her head. Her face, though pale and etched with lines of sorrow, was now set with a quiet, steely resolve. The watery blue of her eyes had hardened, like ice forming on a winter pond. She looked at the judge, but this time she was not looking for kindness. She was looking at an obstacle, one that she now had to move. "Proof, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was no longer the weak, reedy whisper it had been moments before. It was quiet, yes, but it was firm, clear, and steady. "Yes, I have proof." With a deliberateness that commanded the room's attention, she unlatched the worn clasp on her leather folder. The small metallic click was surprisingly loud in the silent room. She didn't rush. She opened it with a reverence, as if she were opening a treasure chest. Inside, nestled against faded blue velvet, was not a single sheet of paper, but a stack of letters, each one yellowed with age and tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The ribbon was frayed and soft, the color of a sky long forgotten. The judge's pen stopped moving. He watched, intrigued despite himself, as her wrinkled, arthritic fingers worked at the bow on the ribbon. It was the slow, careful dance of hands that had performed this ritual many, many times before. She didn't pull the letters out in a messy heap. She lifted the stack as one, separating the top letter from the rest. The paper was so brittle, it looked like it might crumble at the slightest touch. "This is a letter from Mr. Arthur Cresswell to my grandmother, Elspeth," Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice taking on a new tone, a teacher's tone, calm and instructive. "It is dated March the 12th, 1948. She didn't wait for permission to read. She simply began. Her voice at first was a little hesitant, as if she were stepping back in time. "My dearest Elspeth," she read, her eyes scanning the elegant, flowing script. "I hope this letter finds you well. The city is a cold and hungry beast, but I am not afraid, not with our little secret keeping me warm. I took a small jar of the blend to that shopkeeper on Baker Street, the one with the terrible mustache. He tasted it, and his eyes went wide as saucers. He said he had never tasted anything like it. He is a shrewd man, though, and he will not pay what it is worth. Not yet, but he was interested. very interested. This is the beginning, Elspeth. I can feel it in my bones. Our little spice mix will make the whole world smile. She paused, lifting her gaze from the letter to look at the judge. In the gallery, people were leaning forward in their seats. The uncomfortable silence had been replaced by a hushed, rapt silence. The air itself seemed to have changed. The young lawyer for the Cresswell Corporation had stopped smirking. He was now sitting perfectly upright, his eyes narrowed, his own pen frozen in his hand. This was not what he had expected. The judge's smirk had completely vanished. He was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on the bench, his chin propped on his knuckles. He was listening. Mrs. Blackwood selected another letter from the stack. This one was smaller, the paper thinner. This one is from August 1949, she said. Things were not going well. They were struggling. Her voice took on a more somber tone as she read, My dearest Elspeth, I write to you tonight with a heavy heart. The money has run out. The big manufacturers think our little blend is too much trouble. They say the cost of the special process is too high. They want cheaper. They want faster. They do not care about making the world smile. I almost gave up today. I sat on a park bench for 2 hours, ready to throw it all away. But then I remembered my promise to you. Our promise? It is not just a recipe, is it? It is our shared dream. I will not break that promise. Not for all the money in the world. I would rather be poor with you than rich without your friendship. We will find a way together. A woman in the back of the courtroom discreetly wiped a tear from her cheek. The judge's face was now a mask of intense concentration. His logical mind, which had so quickly and brutally dismissed the case, was now processing the data, the dates, the details, the specific mention of a special process. The tone of the letters was not one of business associates, but of a deep, abiding friendship and shared struggle. This was not the rambling, incoherent fantasy of a lonely old woman. This was a story, and many more, Your Honor, Mrs. Blackwood said, her voice gaining strength with every word. Letters from when they were happy, letters from when they were desperate. But there is one more. I think this one is the most important. She held up a final letter. This one was different. The paper was thicker, cream-colored. It had the letterhead of a law firm. This is the letter he wrote to my grandmother on the day he finally got his big break, she explained. The day he sold the recipe and got the money to start his company. She took a deep breath, and the words that came next were etched into her memory, as if she had read them 1,000 times. My dearest, dearest Elspeth, we did it. I signed the papers today. It is real. They are calling it Cresswell's Comfort Seasoning. I know you would have wanted it to be called the Cresswell Blackwood Blend, but this is what they wanted. A name for one man, they said. But it is our name, Elspeth. You and me. The lawyer drew up all the official papers for the company, but they do not matter as much as this one. This one is for you. I am wiring you the first payment tomorrow. It is half of everything I received. Not as a loan, not as a gift, but as your share, our share. As promised, please, take the money. Buy yourself a nice house, a warm coat. Live a little. You have earned it 100 times over. Your friend always, Arthur. She finished reading, and the courtroom was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. The judge stared at her, his eyes wide. He looked from the old woman's resolute face to the brittle letter in her hand, and for the first time that day he saw it. He didn't see a joke. He didn't see a waste of time. He saw a legacy, a promise, and a betrayal that had spanned a lifetime. The certainty with which he had begun the afternoon had evaporated, replaced by a chilling and profound dawning of reality. This was not an absurd case at all. It was a tragedy, and he had just laughed at it. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just quiet. It had become a presence, a thick, heavy blanket that smothered every other sound. Every person in the room, from the clerk at her desk to the last person in the gallery, was holding their breath. The story that had poured from the brittle, yellowed pages was no longer just a claim. It was a narrative, rich with the texture of real life, full of struggle, hope, and the intimate language of friendship. The judge sat perfectly still, his body rigid, his face a study in deep concentration. The mask of cynical impatience had been shattered, and beneath it was a man who was realizing he had been profoundly, terribly wrong. The young lawyer from the Cresswell Corporation was the one to finally break the spell. His face, which had been a canvas of smug confidence, was now tight with alarm. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He had to stop this. He had to regain control of the narrative, to pull it back from the emotional whirlpool it was becoming, and force it back into the dry, logical world of legal procedure.
Ouch.
Your Honor, I must object, he said, his voice sharp and a little too loud, a clear sign of his panic. This is completely irrelevant. These are sentimental letters. They are hearsay. They have no legal standing whatsoever. A promise between friends is not a binding contract. We are here to discuss facts, not to read old love letters. The judge's head snapped toward the lawyer, and for a moment the familiar fire returned to his eyes. Are you finished, counsel? He asked, his voice low and dangerously calm. The lawyer, taken aback by the judge's tone, simply nodded and sat back down. His face flushed with embarrassment. Judge Finch's gaze then returned to the small woman in the witness stand. He was no longer seeing a foolish old woman. He was seeing a historian, the soul keeper of a forgotten truth. He felt a knot of something cold and tight form in his gut. It was the feeling of dread, the dawning awareness that his arrogance had led him into a trap of his own making. He had dismissed her so quickly, so publicly, that now he could not simply reverse course without making a fool of himself. But he also could not, in good conscience, let this be swept aside. Mrs. Blackwood, the judge said, his voice now softer, stripped of all its earlier scorn. The lawyer makes a valid point, from a certain perspective. These letters are compelling, but they are not in themselves legal proof of a business agreement. They speak of a promise, of a share. But the law requires more than words. It requires formality. He expected her to falter. He expected her to look defeated, to admit that all she had was a box of old memories. But a flicker of something that looked almost like pity crossed Mrs. Blackwood's face. It was as if she felt sorry for the judge, sorry for the lawyer, for all the people who believed that the only things that mattered were the things that could be filed away in a cabinet. I understand, Your Honor, she said, her voice gentle but firm. My grandmother understood too. Mr. Cresswell was not a foolish man. He knew words could be forgotten. He knew promises could be broken. That is why he put it in writing. She reached back into her folder. But this time, she didn't pull out another letter. She pulled out a single folded sheet of what looked like parchment. It was darker than the letters, the color of strong tea, and it was so brittle that it looked as if it would crumble into dust at the slightest touch. She handled it with the utmost care, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded it, revealing a single handwritten page. The judge leaned forward so far he was almost out of his chair. He could see, even from his bench, that the handwriting on the page was the same elegant, flowing script as the letters. But this was different. It wasn't a story. It was a list. A formula. At the top, in bold, clear letters, were the words, "The Cresswell Blackwood Legacy." This is the original formulation, Mrs. Blackwood explained, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. This is what Mr. Cresswell took to the manufacturers. She held the document up for the bailiff to take. As the bailiff carried it up to the judge's bench, everyone watched, mesmerized. The judge took it with a reverence he didn't know he possessed. He put on his reading glasses, his hands careful not to put any pressure on the fragile paper. His eyes scanned the list of ingredients. He saw common things: salt, pepper, garlic powder, paprika. But then he saw things he had never heard of. Names of roots and barks from faraway places. Ingredients with strange, exotic names. But it wasn't just the list that was important. It was the instructions that followed. They weren't simple. They weren't like the instructions on a packet of cake mix. They were complex, almost scientific. They spoke of precise temperatures, of specific lengths of time for roasting, of a method for grinding that seemed impossibly complicated. And then there was a line, circled in the same ink, that made his breath catch in his throat. The enzymatic activation of the umami bloom. He had no idea what that meant, but it sounded incredibly specific. Incredibly. Secret, then he saw it. At the bottom of the page, below the complex instructions, were two signatures, side by side. One said Arthur Cresswell, the other said Elspeth Blackwood. And between them was a single sentence, written in Arthur Cresswell's hand. A pact of equals, forever bound by this secret. The judge felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. This was it. This was the smoking gun. It wasn't just a recipe. It was a signed, joint creation. This was the proof he had so arrogantly demanded. Mrs. Blackwood, who had been watching his face, spoke again. My grandmother knew, Your Honor. She knew that even with a signed piece of paper, a big company would find a way. A big company has lawyers who can twist words. They would say the signature didn't mean a partnership. They would say it was just a token. So she did something else. She found someone who could understand the secret. Someone who could explain why it was so special, and why it couldn't just be copied. From her folder, she produced a single, modern-looking document. It was a notarized affidavit. I would like to submit into evidence an affidavit from Dr. Eris Thorne. The judge looked up, bewildered. Dr. Eris Thorne. He was a food scientist, Mrs. Blackwood explained. He worked for one of the big manufacturers that turned Mr. Cresswell away. He was the only one who saw the genius in the process. He is a very old man now, retired, but he remembers. He remembers because he was fired for trying to convince his bosses to invest in it. The judge, his heart now pounding against his ribs, took the affidavit. It was only a few pages long. He began to read Dr. Thorne's statement. The scientist explained, in clear, unemotional language, what the handwritten recipe meant. He wrote that the enzymatic activation was a revolutionary food science technique that was decades ahead of its time. He explained that this process created a flavor compound that was not only unique, but was also incredibly stable, giving the seasoning a shelf life far beyond anything else on the market at the time. Most importantly, Dr. Thorne wrote this: the process described in this document is not one that could be stumbled upon by accident. It is not one that could be reverse engineered, even with modern technology, without knowing the precise sequence and timing. It is a true trade secret, a unique and proprietary method. It is, without question, the very method that gives Cresswell's Comfort seasoning its distinctive and unmatchable flavor profile. To this day, I have never seen another product that uses this technique. Judge Finch finished reading and slowly placed the pages face down on his bench. He removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. His eyes squeezed shut. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. It wasn't just the letters anymore. It wasn't just a signed document. It was a signed document corroborated by a world-class food scientist. The old woman's absurd claim wasn't just a claim anymore. It was a fact, supported by evidence that was as solid as the polished wood of his own bench. He lifted his head and looked at the young lawyer from the Cresswell Corporation. The lawyer's face was as white as a sheet. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. He looked like a man who knew his case, and possibly his career had just imploded. The judge then looked at Mrs. Blackwood. She was no longer crying. She was not even looking at him. She was simply sitting there, a quiet, dignified figure, her hands resting in her lap. She had not come for pity. She had come for justice. And she had brought it with her in a worn, leather folder. The judge had laughed at a joke only to discover he was the punchline. And the regret that washed over him now was not a fleeting thought. It was a tidal wave, a soul-crushing realization of his own profound and public failure. The pieces lay scattered on the judge's polished mahogany desk like the ruins of a city. There were the brittle, yellowed letters, filled with the language of friendship and shared dreams. There was the faded hand-drawn recipe, a document that was as much a pact as it was a formula. And there was the affidavit, the cold, scientific. An irrefutable proof that turned a sentimental story into an unshakable fact. Judge Finch stared at them, but he wasn't really seeing them. He was seeing his own reflection in the polished surface of the wood. It was the face of a man who had made a terrible, terrible mistake. The cold knot of dread in his stomach had now turned into a churning sea of shame. His laughter, the sound of it, replayed in his mind, but this time it wasn't a sound of amusement. It was the sound of cruelty. It was the sound of arrogance. It was the sound of a man who was supposed to be the guardian of truth, publicly mocking the very thing he had sworn to protect. He looked up from the papers, and his eyes fell upon Mrs. Blackwood. She sat there, a small, quiet silhouette against the dark wood of the witness stand. The brim of her hat was still pulled low, but he could see the faint outline of her jaw, set with a quiet, unbreakable dignity. He had seen her as a nuisance, an annoyance, a pathetic relic from a forgotten time. He had reduced her life, her grandmother's memory, and a lifetime of injustice to a single, scornful laugh. And now, faced with the overwhelming weight of her truth, he felt a profound and crushing regret. It was a feeling so powerful it was almost physical, a hot flush of shame that crept up his neck and burned his ears. He had always prided himself on his ability to see through deception, to cut through the noise, to find the facts. But in his haste, in his arrogance, he hadn't just missed the facts. He had trampled all over them. The young lawyer for the Cresswell Corporation seemed to shrink in his expensive suit. He was pale, his usually confident posture now slumped. He looked at the papers on the judge's desk, then at Mrs. Blackwood, and then at the clock on the wall, as if hoping he could somehow rewind the last hour. He knew the case was lost. More than that, he knew his firm's reputation, built on being tough and unbeatable, had just been shattered not by a clever legal maneuver, but by the simple, unyielding power of a true story. The judge took a deep, shaky breath, the sound of it loud in the cavernous silence of the room. He had to do something. He had to say something. The rules of the court, the procedures he had followed his entire life, felt like flimsy, meaningless things now. He had broken a more important rule. He had broken the rule of human decency, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could not simply proceed as if nothing had happened. He could not rule on the evidence without first addressing the injustice he had committed. The court could not be about the law if it was not also about the truth, and the truth right now was that he had been wrong. He slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. It was an unusual movement in a courtroom, and everyone's eyes snapped to him. The movement was slow, heavy, as if he were physically bearing the weight of his own failure. He did not look at the lawyers. He did not look at his clerk. He looked only at Mrs. Blackwood. For a long moment, he just stood there, searching for words. What could he possibly say? A simple "I'm sorry" felt like an insult, a flimsy bandage on a deep, gaping wound. How do you apologize for publicly humiliating a person for speaking their truth? How do you apologize for laughing at a lifetime of pain? He cleared his throat, the sound raspy and unnatural. There is no objection from this bench," he began, his voice thick with an emotion that no one in that courtroom had ever heard from him before. It was not the voice of a powerful judge. It was the voice of a humbled man. And there is something else that needs to be said. Something that is far more important than any ruling I could make today. He paused, gathering his thoughts, his eyes fixed on the old woman. He could see her shoulders tighten, as if bracing herself for another blow. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on her name. "When you first began to speak, I laughed. I laughed at your story. I laughed at you. There is no excuse for my behavior. It was arrogant. It was cruel, and it was profoundly wrong." He took a step down from his dais, a movement so unexpected that a collective, sharp intake of breath came from the gallery. A judge never leaves the bench during a hearing. Never. But Judge Finch kept walking, slowly, until he was standing at the foot of the witness stand, looking up at her. He was no longer a figure of authority looking down. He was just a man, looking up at a woman he had wronged. "I am ashamed of my actions," he continued, his voice now low and intense, filled with a sincerity that was undeniable. "I came into this courtroom today with a closed mind and a hardened heart. I was impatient, and I was dismissive. I failed in my most fundamental duty, which is to listen. I failed to see the person standing in front of me, and I failed to respect the truth you brought here. And for that, I am deeply and I hope you will believe me. I am profoundly sorry." The words hung in the air, so raw and so real that they seemed to change the very atmosphere of the room. In the gallery, people were frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. They were witnessing something that went far beyond a legal case. They were witnessing a moment of true, unvarnished repentance. The young lawyer from the Cresswell Corporation stared at his shoes, unable to watch. The judge's own clerk sat with her hands over her mouth. Her eyes glistening with tears, Mrs. Blackwood slowly lifted her head. She looked down at the man standing before her. This powerful figure who was now offering not a legal ruling, but a piece of his own shattered pride. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the deep and genuine regret that etched lines around them that had nothing to do with age. She saw not a judge apologizing for a legal error, but a human being apologizing for a human failing. Her face, which had been a mask of quiet endurance for so long, finally softened. The hard, icy glaze in her pale blue eyes melted away, replaced by a look of quiet understanding. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just looked at him, and in that look, there was no triumph, no bitterness. No, I told you so. There was only the calm, peaceful grace of a person who had carried a heavy burden for a long time, and was finally, truly being seen. Judge Finch stood there, exposed and vulnerable, waiting for a response. He had not asked for forgiveness, because he knew he had no right to. He had simply offered his regret, naked and unadorned. Finally, Mrs. Blackwood gave a slow, small nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness. Not yet. It was a simple acknowledgement, an acceptance of his apology. She then spoke, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried a weight of its own. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. "Thank you for listening now." Those few words, so simple, so humble, struck the judge with more force than any legal argument ever could. They were a gift he did not deserve. He felt a lump form in his throat, and he had to fight to keep his composure. He gave her another nod, a silent promise between them, and then he turned and walked back to his bench. He moved differently now. The arrogance was gone. The sharp, impatient energy had been replaced by a quiet, solemn gravity. He had come into his own courtroom expecting to teach a lesson. Instead, he had been taught one. And as he sat back down in his chair, the weight of his robes felt heavier than ever before, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of his own fallibility and the immense responsibility he now felt to do what was right. The regret was still there, a deep ache in his soul, but it was no longer just a source of shame. It had been transformed by a quiet old woman's grace into a fierce, unwavering resolve to deliver the justice he had so nearly denied her. The silence that followed the judge's apology was not the heavy, uncomfortable silence of before. It was a sacred, hushed quiet, the kind that settles in a place after something truly profound has happened. Judge Finch sat back down on his bench, but the man who returned to the chair was not the same man who had left it. The arrogant shell had cracked and fallen away, revealing a core of something far more solid and real. He looked at the papers on his desk once more, but this time he didn't see them as legal documents to be dissected. He saw them as the pages of a human life, a story of friendship, betrayal, and a promise that had refused to die. He took a moment, his eyes closed, as if he were recalibrating his entire understanding of the law. The law, he realized in that moment, was not just a set of rules and precedents. It was a tool that could be used to crush people, or it could be used to lift them up. And he, as a judge, was the one who decided how to wield it. He had almost used it to crush Mrs. Blackwood. He would not make that mistake again. When he opened his eyes, they were clear and sharp, but the coldness was gone. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the truth and would now defend it with everything he had. "This court will now render its judgment," he said. His voice was calm, steady, and carried an authority that was no longer born of arrogance, but of conviction. The young lawyer from the Cresswell Corporation tensed, instinctively rising to his feet, ready to argue to find some loophole, some last-ditch technicality to save his client. But one look from the judge made him freeze. It wasn't a look of anger, but a look of such piercing, undeniable certainty that the lawyer knew all his arguments were useless. The truth had already been spoken. Judge Finch did not consult any law books. He did not need to. The evidence was not just on his desk. It had been etched into the very soul of the courtroom. The defendant, Cresswell Culinary Corporation, has built an empire on the foundation of what it claims is its own proprietary recipe, the judge began, his voice ringing through the silent room. However, the evidence presented in this court, the original signed formulation, the corroborating testimony of a respected food scientist, and the decades of personal correspondence paints a starkly different picture. The picture is not one of invention but of theft, not of innovation but of appropriation. He looked directly at the now petrified young lawyer. The claim by Mrs. Agnes Blackwood is not, as I so foolishly and wrongly suggested, a sentimental tale. It is a claim of fact, supported by overwhelming evidence. The Cresswell's comfort seasoning is not, and has never been, the sole creation of the Cresswell family. It is the Cresswell Blackwood legacy, a name that was deliberately erased for the sake of corporate branding and personal greed. He paused, letting his words sink in. He was not just making a ruling. He was rewriting history. Therefore, this court finds in favor of the petitioner, Mrs. Agnes Blackwood, he declared. But a simple monetary award for damages is not justice. The original promise, the very pact at the heart of this case, was not a loan to be repaid or a debt to be settled. It was a partnership. It was a promise of an equal share in everything their creation would become. He leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk, his gaze locked on the corporate lawyer. Arthur Cresswell Sr. broke his promise. He broke his word to his dearest friend. His son, and the corporation that bears his name, have profited from that betrayal for decades. Justice, in this case, requires not a payment, but a restoration. It requires honoring the promise that was made. The judge's next words sent a shockwave through the entire legal and business world, a shockwave that would be felt for years to come. This court orders that a 50% ownership stake in the Cresswell's comfort seasoning brand, and all associated intellectual properties, be immediately transferred from Cresswell Culinary Corporation to the estate of Mrs. Agnes Blackwood, to be held in trust for her and her descendants. The promise of an equal share will be honored. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. It wasn't just a win. It was a complete and total victory. It was a fairy tale ending written in the stark, uncompromising language of a legal ruling. The lawyer for the Cresswell Corporation looked as if he had seen a ghost. His face was ashen, his mouth agape. He had come prepared for a nuisance settlement, maybe a small payout to make the old woman go away. He was not prepared to lose half of his client's entire company. Judge Finch did not revel in his victory. He simply signed the official order, his hand moving with a slow, deliberate finality. He slid the paper across the desk to the bailiff. "This order is to be executed immediately," he said. Then he did something else that was completely unprecedented. He looked at Mrs. Blackwood, who was sitting in stunned silence, her hand over her mouth. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice once again gentle, "I want to apologize to you once more. Not just for my laughter, but for every person in a position of power who ever dismissed you, whoever called you a fool, whoever told you that your truth didn't matter. Your truth mattered. It always did." With that, he slammed the gavel down, the sound not one of anger, but of finality, of a story brought to its rightful conclusion. "This court is adjourned. It's about another word." He stood up and walked out of his own courtroom, leaving everyone else to sit in the wake of the storm he had just unleashed. The story of what happened in courtroom number 3 that day became a legend. It wasn't just a legal case. It became a parable, a story told in law schools and in corporate boardrooms for generations to come. It wasn't really about the money or the seasoning or even the recipe. It was about the moment a powerful man was humbled by the quiet dignity of an old woman and the undeniable power of a long-held truth. It became known as the day the judge learned to listen. For Judge Finch, the incident marked a turning point in his life and his career. The laughter had been stripped away, and in its place grew a profound and lasting empathy. He became a different judge, a different man. He was still firm, still demanding of the facts. But there was a new patience in him, a new willingness to look beyond the surface of things. He took on more pro bono cases for the elderly and the disenfranchised. He became known for his kindness, for the way he would lean forward and truly listen to the least powerful person in his court. Making sure their voice was heard, he never laughed in his courtroom again. The sound of his own mocking laughter was a memory he carried with him, not as a source of shame, but as a constant reminder of the person he once was and the person he had vowed to become. The day he had laughed at Mrs. Blackwood became the most important day of his career. The day he learned that the true administration of justice was not about winning arguments, but about honoring the truth, no matter how quietly or humbly it might be spoken. And in the end, that was a legacy far more valuable than any he could have built on his own.